Yo, what is on, guys? Welcome back to another brand new video. Now, this video is going to be me talking about Tenpai after testing it for about a week now. Now, I do know that I made a video recently talking about the full guide of Tenpai, but that was more of like an introductory video. Pretty much just me copy and pasting most of what content creators have been talking about with my own little twist to it. So, I'm not fully copywriting people, but yeah, it was very similar to a lot of other content creators out there, just with the new ban list. But now that I had the experience myself playing Tenpai, I feel like I am a little bit more educated on playing this deck, especially since I have a lot of reps in. Just spamming a bunch of games with this deck has gave me a brand new perspective on the deck that's a lot different than what I originally had with my introductory video. So I did want to talk about it a little bit and then explain some of my theories behind it, because obviously theory and actually playing the game are vastly different. So I think this video will be informative, especially for people out there who are playing Tenpai. So I don't know what I'll title this video yet, but it will be more of an intermediate to advanced Tenpai with the actual playtesting backed up by my case, right? So I do think the ratios of Tenpai monsters, let's just start off, is pretty much solved, I think. I do think you need 3 Pydra, 3 Chandra, and 2 Fadra. Now, the one thing that I did try with this deck is the 1 Fadra, but you do need to realize with this deck is that sometimes a lot of people do side into like DD Crows against your deck, and especially with the grind games and things like that, even when you do play such as like Hermetic Seal, or like you tag out using Bident Dragon, for example, in the battle phase, you can get hit with a lot of things that you wouldn't even expect to get hit by, such as 1, DD Crow in your Bident, number 2, just a random Ghost Mourner in the battle phase. And because of that, you're forced to play this grind game outright, which all ties into how my extra deck works too, because you kind of realize that, like, this deck doesn't have really good grind game. I mean, it basically doesn't have one at all, but you do need that second one because you aren't always guaranteed to enter the first battle phase and kill them that turn. There are times where you have to do a small play, attempt to go for battle phase, attempt to go for game, you get stopped, and then you have to try again next turn, and the Fadra actually comes up in that game state, right? And this card isn't even that bad to draw. I mean, obviously the other ones are better, but it's not like a brick, right? Like, it still does something. So I do think the 2 Fadra makes a lot of sense. It does remind me of playing like Taie in Sword Soul. So shout outs to all the Sword Soul players, because if you guys know that, there's a reason why we played 2 Taie and 3 Moye, right, and not 1 Taie, because even though, like, obviously you can't use Taie immediately, it does come up in the second turn, third turns, and even with a lot of the other lines that you can do with this deck. And then next up, we're going to be playing 3 Sengen Summon, no need for that. Terraforming, 3 Common, Prosperity, Lightning Storm, and Heartbeat. So let's go ahead and break this down. So in my original video, I actually had the Crystal Wing package, the whole entire Crystal Wing, along with Ancient Fairy Dragon, Zulkin, and whatever field spell of your choice, whether that be Necro Valley or Secret Village, and so on and so forth. But let's go ahead and talk about why those cards have been cut, right? So one of the cool things about this deck actually is that it's immunity to a bunch of variety of hand traps. You basically cannot nib this deck. You basically cannot really Mourner, Veiler, imperm this deck. I mean, you can imperm this deck, but it's not like efficient. You have to do like some battle phase things, like basically on the attack declaration of one of these cards, you can imperm, which is a pretty good spot to imperm, but realistically, that's not really going to happen. And the combo, right, like that whole Ancient Fairy Zulkin combo loses to every hand trap. So I don't know why we're playing into every hand trap when our deck already has that built-in protection from hand traps naturally to the way that our deck plays, right? So it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Another thing I need to actually bring up is the mind games of going first and second about this with this deck. Now, I do know this deck is honestly in its early stages, and people are still going to probably make you go first as the Tenpai player. But through my testing, I do realize that with this deck, you essentially just still, as the opponent, right, you still should just go first against this deck. It doesn't make actually any sense for this to make this deck go second. And before we actually get into that, I'm gonna go ahead and finish this, because that's like a whole speech in it of itself. So I do want to make like a little short pause here and then go over that idea in itself, so I can like timestamp it clearly, right? But because of that, yeah, we don't play all those cards, because we're always going second. We don't want to lose to hand traps, and if our opponent is smart, they will choose to go first again. So we can never actually resolve that whole entire Crystal Wing Secret Village combo. It doesn't make any sense. 3 Kaiman, and then Prod of Prosperity with the Lightning Storms and Harpies. I do think these make sense in this deck, because it's the only way to clear backfield. If you're going to play a deck that essentially has no back removal at all, but is very fragile in the sense that you need to stick a monster on field, if you can't get rid of back row in some way in your deck, you know, it kind of sucks down. With the prosperity, it gives you more odds to see some of these cards. So Lightning Storm Harpies makes 100% sense in this deck. I want to talk about another card that a lot of people have been talking about, debating, and playing, and that is a Pot of Desires in this deck. So the reason why you play Pot of Desires is because this deck actually is a little bit inconsistent, and that does make a lot of sense. Even though you do have a 6 card essentially every time, it does get bricky a lot. When you start playing this deck, you'll start to notice that there's a lot of hands in this deck actually where you'll draw like 5 hand traps and just no ways to play, and that's a reason why people play Pot of Desires, right? Because it doesn't actually conflict with the deck at all unless you banish, like, you know, everything, right? Which, you know, isn't really going to happen realistically. This deck is very similar in terms of its ratios to Sword Soul, which is why it can play Desires. And I get the reasoning why you would play Desires and Prosperity together, more consistency. However, the reason why I'm actually against that, even though by the way, guys, my favorite card of all time is Pot of Desires, so I'm the biggest Pot of Desires, you know, defender, right? And through testing Desires, I do understand why, right? It's not like I don't understand why you play Desires, but I do think the nature of this deck is you have to take that risk in bricking, right? And I did make a video on this way back in the day. I'm talking about 2 or 3 months ago, and it's to build your decks inconsistently. Now, when I say that, it's more of a clickbait title, if anything, but the idea there makes a lot of sense, and it can be applied into this deck as well, right? The reason why I actually think that you don't need to build this deck to its maximum capacity of consistency, because with this deck, in the way that it's made, it's extremely fragile on its normal summon and how it combos, right? You must stop your opponent, right? You can't like throw one hand trap and they make a half board. Like, that half board isn't really gonna cut it a lot of times with this deck, right? Because if they can end on like SP and like maybe like another Omni Negate, or like an SP double impermanence, or like a Cosmic to out your field spell, it's really hard for you to actually stick your combo through, right? You need them to full stop. Like, you need to go like Ash, Valor, Imper, Mortar, then they stop, then you summon Hydra. You need them to full stop, and the thing is, Desires, naturally, by playing Desires, you have to cut more non-engine cards. And what's going to happen is, yes, you will draw a lot of playable hands, but if you draw Hydra, Sengen Manor, summoning, Sengen summoning Hydra, and maybe like one Lightning Storm, it's still not going to cut it, right? Like, you can't do that because that one Lightning Storm is probably not clearing their board, and then you can't actually stick your monster through, right? That's a real thing with this deck. Like, you actually have to full stop them a lot of the times. Now, obviously, there is some weird game states where, like, you know, oh, maybe like you just Ash Bonfire and they pass, right? Duh. But, you know, for the most part, you need your opponent to full stop, and I think Desires doesn't really add that fact, but it does add the fact that your deck could be more consistent. But again, you are going second all the time, and what good is it if you draw a full extender hand if you cannot play through the interruptions, right? Because this deck naturally isn't going to break any board. You do need the non-engine, and it makes a lot of sense. It plays 20 non-engine for a reason, because its engine cannot break through boards, and that's essentially why I do not like Pot of Desires in this deck, because to me, it doesn't make any sense through the nature of this deck. So hopefully that was a good explanation. I might link the video that I made a long time ago down in the description below, but it is the same theory of that. So I'm gonna go ahead and pause this video right now, and we'll go over to some of the more topics I want to talk about in the next portion of this video, especially with my reasonings on why you don't play like the Crystal Wing and those type of cards, right? Now, I want to start off this entire portion of this video talking about how the nature of this deck and how it likes to go second, and if you're not playing Tenpai, what your opponent should do against this deck. Now, obviously, some of the very, very popular tech choices against this deck, or this deck plays, is Heatwave and obviously Dimensional Barrier. Very powerful cards to capitalize the fact that your opponent will let you go first, right? Now, just to start off with this entire video, if you guys are watching this, you know, fully, then you guys know my stance on this point, right? I do think that no matter what against this deck, you should pick to go first yourself. You should not make this deck go second. Now, at first glance, it seems pretty obvious, right? Like, oh, just, I mean, they're a go second deck, make them go second. Now let's go ahead and break down this entire theory one by one, because it is a mouthful. So I do want to, obviously timestamp this point. So, this part of the video is going to be an insane ramble, right? So let's actually talk about how this deck looks comparison to a lot of the other decks that have the same similar playstyle, right? If you actually think about it, let's take a second to remove the skin off these cards, right? And what I mean by that is, let's take Pydra, Chandra, Fadra, Sengen Summoning, Terraforming, Sengen Kaiman, Prosperity out of the deck, and let's say we add in Snake Eye Ash, Bonfire, Poplar, Wanted, Witch, right? Let's say we just skin this deck over a Snake Eyes deck, right? It follows a very similar theory, right? Hand trap your opponent to death, but instead of summoning Pydra, we summon Snake Eye Ash, and that in itself is like an FTK already, right? But the only difference is the Snake Eyes deck has an actual combo going first. Very similar to how another deck relates to this deck too is Mathmech, right? Mathmech does the exact same thing. You just Nib, Ash, Veiler, Mourner, hand trap, hand trap, hand trap. Okay, my turn. Sign up mining, discard, Mathmech Circular, activate this effect. The only difference is the Circular deck can actually go first as well. And this deck is very similar, even though it is a blind second deck. It doesn't really have blind second traits, right? Obviously outside of their regular effects. And what I mean by traits, I mean cards such as like let's say Sky Striker, for example, right? It has cards like Afterburners and Jamming Waves, right? That are completely unusable when you go first, right? And obviously I understand, like, these cards they don't have any effects when they go first because it only works in the battle phase. But with Sky Strikers, there's no label for you to go second, right? Like, you can clearly go first with that deck. I've gone first with that deck many times, right? But this deck is completely unusable when you go first. Like, none of the cards actually work. Everything says you must go into the battle phase. You must do things in the battle phase. But it's the same idea. Like, you have to stop your opponent. The theory of the deck on how it goes second is similar across the board with Snake Eyes card, with Mathmech cards, and with whatever deck or engine that you play. It's the same theory. Hand trap, hand trap, hand trap, summon starter. Does it work? Yes, I win. No, I lose, right? So because of that, I actually think it follows the same theory, right? So, for example, are you going to go second against the Snake Eyes deck? No, right? And the reason why, but clearly they can do the exact same thing as the Tenpai deck, right? What's stopping a Snake Eyes deck from just dropping 3 hand traps, summoning Snake Eye Ash? It's the exact same thing, right? It's dropping 3 hand traps and summoning Pydra. It makes absolutely no difference, right? If you can play through the hand traps of this deck and you can beat the starter, let's say you play your going first cards and you flip Skill Drain or something going first, it's the same thing. This deck cannot push through that, right? It just cannot push through that. And very similar to cards, and also in the same way, these decks currently right now, and which is why I don't think these cards are very good. If you notice in my deck, I don't play Heatwave, nor do I play Dimensional Barrier. And the reason why behind that is because if people pick up on this trait more and they have like a better understanding of how this deck works, you would never let this deck go first, or never let this deck go second anyway. So I don't think it makes any sense for you to play Heatwave or Dimensional Barrier, because these cards are, to capitalize on the fact that your opponent will let you go first. Number one. And then number two, you would never pick to go first yourself when you play this deck, because it makes no sense, right? So like, it's a very weird thing that you do with this deck. It's like you feel like you should go first, but you should always go second, and your opponent is wrong for doing that, because like the thing is, like, from your opponent's perspective, they don't know your deck, right? So that's why it's a correct choice for your opponent to pick to go first, because who in the hell would want to get Heatwave / debarriered if they don't know that, right? But you, as the player of the Tenpai deck, you know what you're signing into, which is why you're always going to go second, and they should, in theory, always be going first. So yeah, that's my take on the Heatwave cards and Dimensional Barrier, and why you should always go second with this deck, and why your opponent should always go first with this deck, and overall on why I don't play going first cards in general with the no Crystal Wing, no Secret Village, none of that stuff. I do play Rivalry here because you can randomly draw even going second, and it can actually break a board. So this makes sense, but the more consistent cards of going first, such as Heatwave, does not make any sense. Now, maybe it does in the early stages, like I said, but overall, if this deck gets more and more solved as more events go on, I guarantee you will see Heatwave out of the deck. You won't see Dimensional Barrier. You won't see any of these gimmick Crystal Wing, haha, Zolkin, secret village gimmicks, right? It will be very streamlined as how this deck works, and that's my whole entire take on that aspect, right? So let's go ahead and dive into the hand traps and why I played these certain hand traps and why I actually side these certain hand traps, and then we'll go over the extra deck as well on why this extra deck is very refined, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Now, as you guys can see by my deck, I actually main Dimension Shifter, which is something that I've seen a lot of people side, but not main, right? Now, let's go ahead and go through all of them first, which is Magnamut, Nibiru, Ash Blossom, Imperm, Mourner, and Veiler. Now, first and foremost, I do think the best hand traps currently in this meta will be Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, Mourner, and Imperm. One of the more different ones is going to be Shifter, Magnamut, and I know a lot of people play Nibiru, but I do think Nibiru is one of the more odd ones. And I do think the only reason why I'm playing Nibiru because it makes a lot of sense in my deck in particular, in this Tenpai deck. If not, I actually would not play this card. Let's say if you gave me a Fire King deck or a Snake Eyes deck, currently I probably wouldn't be maining this card because of how unusable it is against Tenpai, right? Now, very similar to, like I said earlier in this video, this deck can be a little bit fragile at times, right? And one of the best things you can do, and I'll give you guys an analogy with Snake Eye cards, because Snake Eye cards are, more, I'm pretty sure a lot of people understand how Snake Eye cards work, which is why, I can give that analogy. But very similar to the way that Nibiru works in Snake Eyes, it works in this deck too. For example, if you can Nibiru your opponent and you normal summon Snake Eye Ash, even if you get impermed here or droplets or whatever, you still have another second line of play. You can actually link those two into whatever you want. If you have Witch in hand, you can go for Phoenix. If you don't have Witch in hand, you can go for a Hida. You can go for so many lines, pass through that imperm, and this card is very similar in how this deck works. Because of how fragile your cards can be sometimes, like normal summon Pydra or Chandra, and some of these cards could get stopped or whatever, and you can go into your main phase too, having this extra body is basically another push in the deck, right? It's a pseudo push in the deck, and I think that's very valuable when you're playing a deck that has that's a very normal summon, hope it sticks type of strategy, right? And if you are doing that type of strategy, I think Nibiru is a very supportive card in the way your deck functions. Not only that, but everyone knows Nibiru is a pretty solid card anyway, so nothing controversial there. Next up I want to talk about is Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter, not only is it a crazy card already, right? It's broken, borderline should have been banned, but I don't see people maining this card, and I'm not sure why, because I do think this card, not only does it have the effects that we all know, being able to, not put cards in the graveyard, but one of its bonus effects is that it also lets your deck have playability even past your opponent not playing, right? So one of the things that could kind of suck, for example, right, let's say this card wasn't Shifter, and let's use Imperm or Veiler as examples, right? Now let's say we Veilered our opponent instead of Shiftering them or Imperming them. Even if they stop, one of the things that kind of suck about this is that if they play Ghost Ogre, or Veiler, or even Droll for that matter, all these cards, their supportive cards after that you Veilered them are still online, right? And it makes this deck, because of the nature of how this deck works, we don't want to be put into this grind game position. We're not trying to get Veilered past, let them play again, right? In theory, we would like to end the game as fast as possible, and obviously it's not like these cards are bad, right? There's so many times where you can Veiler them and they just don't have Ogre, right? Which is why you still play them. But the Shifter breaks that mechanic. Not only are you stopping them from what they're doing, but you're turning off potential cards like Ogre, Veiler, Droll, and all these cards from trying to stop you from getting to OTK. And like the nature of this deck can OTK through Shifter very comfortably, which is why I think Shifter in the theme of this deck makes so much sense that you would put it into the main deck, because it does bypass a lot of hand traps that people use to survive on their turn. So that is why I played Nibiru and Shifter in this deck. Through lots of testing, I do think these cards are some of the best tech slots that you can play, because they support the deck so much in a lot of ways that a lot of people don't really think about on first glance until you actually play them and you realize, oh hey, these cards very support my type of strategy, right? Now let's go ahead and do our final part, and let's talk about the extra deck. Now, first and foremost, this extra deck has been very fine-tuned. As you guys can see from my original video, the extra deck was actually, full of, variety and options at first, but we've now dumbed it down to just 2 Button Dragons, Transcendent Dragon, Trident Dragon, which I don't really think is needed, but I guess sometimes it makes things easier for yourself, right? But yes, you can play without it due to the price tag. I get that, but if you do have the money, you might as well just play it because it makes your life so much more easier. Black Rose Dragon, which comes up every game, Moonlight, which is a very good removal card, and Odd Eyes Meteor Burst. So let's go ahead and talk about the synchros real quick, because we did originally start with a crazy pile of synchros with Ancient Fairy Dragon, Crystal Wing, we even had Samurai Destroyer, we had so many different cards into this deck, and honestly, there are great options in this deck, right? And I'm not saying that this is the extra deck that you have to play forever. Obviously, let's say Yubel. A lot of people don't know what Yubel cards do, but essentially Yubel cards, a lot of the cards, or not a lot of cards, but there's a card that activates into the battle phase just to keep it short. And cards like Samurai Destroyer, kind of out that in some way, right? If you guys can, this card is pretty funny. It reads, if a card battles an opponent's monsters, your opponent cannot activate cards or effect until the damage step, right? So you have a lot of variety of cards that you can honestly play in this deck, and there's so many of them. But honestly, through testing, I realized that all those gimmick cards, or all those situational cards, so to speak, only come up, you know, every like 100 games, and you have to play against specific matchups. But these are the ones that come up the most consistent, right? Now, one of the things that I need to change here for the links is this needs to be Striker Dragon, not Access Code, because I forgot to change that. Now, let's talk about why the synchros are the way they are, right? So obviously, this one, Sengen Bident Dragon, is the one that you're going to be summoning most of the time. 99% of the time, this card is coming down, and you don't even care about the rest. So we aren't really focused on playing random level 7s, because this is our main guy, essentially, right? Imagine we're playing Sword Soul, and we're making something else other than Chi Shao, right, on our turn 1. I mean, sometimes, yeah, sure, you're making Boxia, right? You're making, you know, Draco Berserker. For the most part, we're making our Chi Shao, right? And this guy is our Chi Shao here, so we're making him every time. Translucent is very obvious, or Transcendent is very obvious part of the combo. Trident, very obvious part of the combo. Black Rose Dragon, extremely important in this deck. If you guys play this deck for even just a day, you'd realize that having Sengen mana up and using Black Rose Dragon to clear every card into the main phase, entering battle phase and activating Sengen common is like an OTK in itself, or it's like a high in itself. It's just, it feels so clean. They can't really do anything about it. They need Ash Blossom. If they don't have it, instantly GG. Moonlight is for one of those situational cards that you can use. It's very powerful when you make Erratic Seal as well to play on your opponent's turn, because then your Erratic Seal is not only a bounce, but if they want to continue playing, you can just make Moonlight in them and get your second bounce. So it's a 2-layer interruption, which is very good because people are still making us go first for some reason, which I don't think is right, like I said earlier in the video. Next up is Odd Eyes Meteor Burst Dragon. Now, Meteor Burst and Moonlight are the two cards I think that are like the yin and yang in this deck, because Black Rose is the destroyer of all cards in main phase. But if you don't need to destroy cards in main phase, you just go for your Odd Eyes Meteor Burst, and Meteor Burst essentially stops everything in the battle phase. It's basically you stun them in the battle phase. They couldn't play in the main phase because you had Sengen mana. Now you enter battle phase and they can't play at all because of Meteor Burst. So you just lock them out of 2 phases because, you know, why not, right? And this card is absolutely broken if you want to answer cards like Flameburst Dragon that can't be used in the battle phase. They can't even use cards like, let's say you're playing as Despia, they can't use Quartus. So many cards that block attacks or like stall them so they live another turn. It's just easily responded out by our Odd Eyes Meteor Burst, which is why I do think these are the only 2 cards in terms of utility that you need to play, which is Black Rose and Odd Eyes Meteor Burst. One for the main phase, one for the battle phase. You pick, look at the board, you pick which one you need, you make that one, and it's smooth sailing from there. And then all you have to do is your Bident, Transcendent into Trident Dragon. You'll beat them through Prosperity. Like, it's absolutely broken. And these are all that you need and will only come up. Keep it simple, guys. This deck is not hard to play. One of the easiest decks I've played of all time. It's very simple. You just pick whatever one that it looks right for the occasion, hand trap them to death, and smooth sailing. So let's go ahead and talk about the links real quick. Now, the reason why we played Striker Dragon is that we can put cards into the graveyard to revive them with Fadra, and at the same time, it's our way to make Dark the Dark Charmer, right? Now, the only reason why we play these cards here, the Charmers, the Raging Phoenix, and the Zelantis, is D-Barrier is pretty popular, not crazy popular, I guess, but people do play it, so we want an option to OTK through that, which this deck can actually do. It can do literally the Hida OTK, the Zelantis Princess OTK through that, and it makes a lot of sense because we're done with the synchros. No other synchro is ever going to come up. We just got to prepare for our Dimensional Barrier plays, and if you know, things go south, we can always make these cards, right? Charmers are always really good in this deck. SP being a removal is pretty good, and like I said, they shouldn't make us go first, but in the rare case that someone isn't that expertise in the Tenpai matchup for some reason, they don't know what Tenpai cards do, then maybe they can make us go first, but we don't want to commit to so many go first cards. We don't want to put Zulkin in here. We don't want to put Crystal Wing in here. We're not trying to put a bunch of like bad cards into our deck for the chance that our opponent makes the wrong play. But if they do, we got our Hermetic Seal, and sometimes if you can't OTK them, then Hermetic Seal is a great option to make during your main phase 2, which is something that you can't really do with like Crystal Wing, for example, right? So that's going to be it for this entire one. I know it's another Tenpai video, but I do think this is more an advanced course. If you guys made it this far, which is I think this video is going to be a 30-minute video, then I appreciate that a lot. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and a sub, and let me know what your thoughts on Tenpai, and let me know your thoughts on testing Tenpai, and you guys agree with my points. I'd love to have a debate if you guys don't agree, and I'll catch you all in the next one.